Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Jeff Wellstead. I am the founder of Big Bear Partners and also the principal of Clue Labs. Clue being a very interesting piece of technology that actually helps do all the things we're about to talk about with regard to helping to create a skills first level of data and insight and to each and every individual in your organization, as well as all of the roles in your organization. But typically, I help companies of all sizes and types kind of explore the powerful possibilities of AI in their workplaces. And specifically, I focus on tools that manage super complex data challenges like this one that we're going to talk about. Because AI it just loves that sort of thing in terms of its ability to absorb it. But the reason why we're talking about skills intelligence and dynamic job architecture today is because that's very much in large measure where the future of structuring and work is going to go for, especially for the HR function, but it's going to involve everybody in the company. And when we nail this down and we really kind of start to understand what people need to know, where and at what level of proficiency, we start to kind of create more of a science around how we do things like personalized learning and development, career mapping and navigating. It helps the line managers because it just creates a layer of agency for the employees and for them as well to kind of focus instead of being a micromanager and kind of worrying about all of your development and all of your skill gap issues and things of that nature. It really kind of allows you as a line manager to be a coach, to be a mentor, to be somebody who can help the employee put together all the components of their careers moving forward. It helps HR because you start to get metadata, of course, across the entirety of your company to start understanding what is our talent inventory in various areas, various critical skill areas. What about skill adjacencies as an example? And we'll talk about this concept of building an ontology, which is all the relational elements between skills. And then where do we have gaps? And what are we going to do about that? Are we going to hire more? Are we going to, build internally? Are we going to train and reskill and upskill? Where are we going to invest to make sure we have everything we need to know in place to compete in what we're doing? So this is all about basically ensuring going forward that we are, well prepared for the future. So let's get into it. If you have any questions as you raise them, please use the chat, and Zoe, my extraordinarily able assistant, will happily kind of capture that stuff, and we'll go through that at the end. My aim is to kind of get all of this done by no later than 4 o'clock, but hopefully sooner, and we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. Okay, so this session is really kind of meant to kind of provide you with kind of practical frameworks and actionable strategies, tactics even, to kind of transform your talent operating model. These approaches are, I think, broadly battle tested because this has actually been a thing, for several years now, fortunately. So we have some best practice and lots of lessons learned in order to be able to kind of drive measurable business outcomes and not just theoretical kind of academic concepts. What we're going to do today, hopefully, will teach you kind of more the mastery of the foundations of things like taxonomies and ontologies and graph structures, and help you understand why each of those is important for different use cases in your skills architecture. You'll create a working skills model for one job family is going to be my homework to you today, using kind of like proven templates and validation methods that can scale across your organization. And then we'll try to kind of establish clear proficiency levels. That's basically your level of mastery of a particular skill, backed by observable evidence, moving beyond kind of subjective assessment to much more measurable, kind of capabilities. It's always ever tricky with these things because you can't just go ask people, hey, are you good at this skill? They're going to be like, yes, I am. I'm terrific at this skill. Well, how do we know? Right. And so that's one of the things we have to kind of get our fingers into. And you'll learn how to leverage external benchmarks and market data to kind of ensure that your skills framework reflects sort of real world demands and competitive structures. And then finally, we're going to kind of just cover off how you might be able to execute a focused 60-day talent marketplace pivot, with sort of a clear return on investment, kind of approach that demonstrates the business value of the organizational buy-in. So we're going to kind of go through that as well. I think we can all agree that the nature of work is changing rapidly, and jobs are becoming a lot more fluid and much more project-based rather than kind of fixed roles. This whole concept of I am this job title at this company, therefore I only operate between these boundaries is fast fading away. And so the question then begs, how is it we can make sure that everybody's along for the ride and that we are creating the right structures to kind of help people kind of understand that I can kind of morph my skills in a particular direction. Well, look, a good use case is AI, and how the use of AI agents and eventually an agentic AI system where a lot of agents are connected to each other, possibly across and likely across functions, and performing lots of kind of low level, high volume, but reasonably low value work. Um, there's going to be a bunch of people who are sort of like, well, what am I meant to do now? Because I used to do that stuff manually. That was my job. Well, the question is, how is it you need to kind of change and morph the way you do things, and take on new skills and take on new notions and learnings with regard to the technology because it needs looking after, it needs monitoring, it needs continuous improvement. There's going to be a lot of interesting shifts in terms of the work that you have done in the past versus the work you're going to be doing in the very near future. Um, because AI is really kind of like it's shaping these requirements at an unprecedented pace. And some skills are becoming fast obsolete, new ones are emerging. So we have to keep up. And one of the things we need to do as HR professionals is to make sure that we are monitoring the skill changes that are coming, that we are also helping shepherd people in that direction, as we're probably also, potentially having to kind of restructure our organizations, depending on the level of depth that AI might be challenging us with. Okay, so let's move on then to this notion about what a taxonomy is versus an ontology versus a graph. I mean, these are sort of foundational concepts for building a scalable skills intelligence model. A taxonomy is very, very simple, and you've used them before, right? In terms of any kind of categorization of a thing, is simply a hierarchical list of skills organized by category. So it's your skills filing system, but it's reasonably static, once you've kind of like mapped it out. Whereas an ontology, which is kind of a fancy term and it sounds like really highfalutin, but it's a really cool concept. It adds the relationships and the context to the taxonomy, creating kind of like a web of like meaningful associations between skills and roles and learning paths. So, for instance, what would be a good example? If I have a particular skill related to what would be a good example? Let's take a technical skill. So maybe I know Python, right, as a developer. That's all well and good. But the problem is that the company I've just joined uses tools like JSON, and just a whole level R and a whole level of other types of softwares. And I'm a bit panicked. But my manager says, that's fine. Let's take a look at this from a skills ontology perspective, and let's then kind of see how potentially far away or how close you actually are to really understanding these other programming languages. And an ontology will basically help you understand that. So it'll tell you, for instance, JSON is 75% adjacent to Python. And here are the missing bits that you're just going to have to tack on to your knowledge, with regard to the JSON tool, or JSON programming language. And, within the space of 4 weeks, you'll be very proficient at running it. So don't panic. Don't worry about it. This is going to be part of your onboarding process. So that's an example of how an ontology can really kind of help you understand all that. A graph is the technical representation that enables AI-powered inference. Okay, so in other words, some things are not always obvious or explicit or spelled out for us. Sometimes there has to be some kind of an inference with regard to, a particular skill set that kind of says, I know these 5 things, and the AI can take a look at that and say, well, that's interesting. If you know those 5 things, you also probably know these 4 things with a very, very high degree of proficiency. And so that a graph can kind of help you understand, again, those relationships. Um, and it allows the system to kind of help predict skill gaps as well and recommend career paths and identify kind of talent matches on a relatively automatic basis. So that's super helpful and useful. So you can imagine yourself comparing your own, say, job description and the skills required within the current kind of role that you're playing. And then you go shopping for, well, what's next for me? Either within, say, my job family or possibly laterally. Maybe I just want to make a shift completely out. Maybe I'm in customer service. And what I want to do is I want to actually move into marketing because all of this work I have been doing in customer care and customer service has educated me to such a high degree that I know every product that this company sells, possibly better than the marketeers do. So I'm bringing a lot of powerful subject matter expertise knowledge to this equation. What I don't know is how to do marketing as yet, but I can learn that sort of thing. So that's why graphs are useful. And each of these, as you can understand, kind of serve a different purpose, right, in the technical architecture, and enables different kinds of organizational capabilities. But understanding these things are super, super helpful to make sure that we've got the right package. This kind of talks a little bit about I guess what I would call our North Star architecture, which powers the skills intelligence platform. The architecture follows a very clear data pipeline, right? It takes in raw data from various sources and it transforms it into powerful business applications. And the key steps in this pipeline include extracting and normalizing skills data from sources like job descriptions and employee profiles. Any of you HR folks that have walked into your new organization and said, "Great, can you someone show me where we keep all of our job descriptions? I've just been asked, to go hire 5 different types of people, and I just really kind of want to understand what those roles look like." And then everybody looks at you like, "Oh boy, we either don't have them, or if we have them, they're probably 5 years old." And if they're 5 years old, and even if they're less than 5 years old, it changes on a dime, depends on who's looking for what. So, you have to almost go by what the hiring manager is telling you they need. That is not a clever system, right? What you need is something that is consistent. You need something you can refer to. And there's got to be some shared understanding of the semantics involved with this. And we're going to talk about that. So that normalizing skills data element is critical if you are all going to have conversations about the same skills. Okay. Building a comprehensive skills graph that captures things like the relationships, the proficiency levels, and the business context is super important. I know this sounds like a lot, but trust me when I tell you, if you did this work, you would be able to manage your function and support your people in a far more scientific way than potentially you're able to today. Because leveraging the sort of unified skills intelligence and power, to kind of power use cases like internal mobility, as an example, or targeted personalized learning or strategic recruitment is really kind of the way forward. And so you have to kind of put these elements, together in order to kind of make that happen. So I think the critical message here is that organizations often try to kind of tackle skills mapping across every role all at once, right? That's a boiling the ocean kind of mentality, and that's a mistake. Instead, I think you should start to really kind of narrow and focus on, say, one job family, right? Because that in and of itself, when you go to levels of granularity, will seem complex enough, but you'll learn loads about what that job family does and what the roles within that job family actually perform. Okay. Um, if you choose the right job family, that's really super useful and critical as well. You want to look for clear skills requirements. So that's why oftentimes when you look at like skills first organizations, they often started with, say, the technical side of the business first, or maybe finance, possibly HR, where the the capabilities, the responsibilities, the accountabilities of those roles are well known, right? And they're shared across multiple organizations, so they're easy to benchmark and get clarity on. Whereas other roles, sales, for instance, really can vary dramatically. I mean, there's always ever going to be some core kind of skills and competencies associated with a sales role, of course, influencing skills, relational, capability, high emotional EQ, good with numbers, things of that nature. But then there will be lots of nuance associated with a sales job, depending on the type of company that you're working with, right? So, um, once you've kind of like selected a job family, you need to kind of identify somewhere in the neighborhood of between 15 and say 25 core skills that differentiate high performers. Okay. So you want to be more as specific as you can about that. And this is where you as an HR person almost take on the role of kind of being a data scientist. And you basically want to work with the people leaders in that space to say, what do top performers bring to this equation? If you had to build a team from scratch, a dream team, the ones that would win whatever global title, whatever gold medal, what skills would they have to have? And try to capture, like I said, somewhere between 15 and 25. You may not end up using them all, but again, these need to be kind of be core. And of course, you always ever want to include both technical kind of capabilities as well as what they refer to as soft skills. I love that expression. And it's frankly wrong because those aren't soft skills. Those, in my view, are the hard skills. Those are the difficult skills. Anybody can kind of learn a lot of the technical stuff. There are obviously different and varying degrees of proficiency in understanding and working with technical stuff, but it's your interpersonal capabilities and the way that you kind of think about problems, the way that you kind of approach complexity in your life. Those are the things typically that will kind of indicate, if somebody's going to be successful in their role. Not to say that technical proficiency isn't important. It is to a degree, of course, but the other ones will get you far. Um, then the next kind of process in this would be mapping adjacent skills from related functions, right, to enable kind of like an internal talent mobility and succession planning possibility. So in other words, this is kind of working out the ontological or ontology components, the relationships between skills and each other. And that's important. And hopefully, once you do it, you don't have to continue to revisit that over and over again. And then you draft the proficiency definitions, looking at observable behaviors. This is the behaviors of the individuals. Once you've actually determined what the role should encompass in terms of skills and proficiency levels within those skills, right? The question is now, how do we scientifically observe and look for signs that somebody has achieved a certain skill level? This bit's tricky. A lot of companies and a lot of softwares use very, very different approaches to this. Sometimes they use sort of tried and tested and proven, kind of online assessment tools, which you can do quite easily, with tech tools and things of that nature, with tech skills, I should say. Otherwise, in terms of the quote unquote soft skills, you might have to use tools like psychometric tools and things of that nature. And you start to get into, even though those things are statistically valid because they've been around and tested and measured and assessed quite carefully over the course of many years, um, it's not always a perfect match. But that's true, frankly, about any of this level of assessment. You're really kind of looking for, whether or not you got into the right neighborhood, whether or not the person who is being assessed from a skills perspective looks at that and says, yeah, that's a credible list. I get that. And I get my gaps. I understand that too. Question I have is now, how do I go fix those things? So then finally, it's again kind of crucial to validate the framework, right, with subject matter experts. Make sure people look at this, not just you, but people are actually feeding into it, and you're doing the facilitation of challenging them on these elements, making sure that they're using the same language to describe the same thing versus kind of adding in their own kind of particular flavor to the process. You need to keep people on the straight and narrow to create this level of accurate uh, measurement. So this is a lot. Don't panic. It's just meant to show you the level of sort of the core schema, if you will, in terms of what the key components are that often define a standardized skill in your system. Um, the skill object is a unique identifier. It's got a clear definition, a hierarchical categorization, observable proficiency indicators, and relationships to related skills. And then, of course, market demand data. That's typically what you kind of want for every one of your skills. And again, don't panic. You don't have to do this from scratch. There are, as I'll show you, a number of interesting, useful bodies of knowledge that you can draw upon where all of this stuff has already been predetermined. And we'll talk about those in a minute. But this structure it creates consistency and it ensures kind of interoperability and it kind of enables a powerful functionality across the different use cases and systems. So in other words, once you have this so well defined, it becomes a reference guide. It becomes super useful as you're trying to kind of figure out what the matrix of skills are that an individual either needs to have to be in a role at a particular level or has and possibly has gaps. And you want to be able to kind of much more finely slice and dice that so that you can make sense of it. And somebody can then say, oh, okay, so here are the gaps, and here's what I need to go fulfill from a developmental perspective. Or this is what I need to learn and master before I make a move from this role to whatever new role I want to go into. Okay. So understanding the anatomy of that is crucial, right, for building a robust and kind of flexible skill infrastructure. And then here we talk about sort of in this particular case, and you can choose however many levels you want to, but I would say minimally from a proficiency perspective, um, you want to start at maybe 4 levels of proficiency. But in this particular example, we're going to do 6 levels of proficiency. And the scale ranges from none. I have no idea what you're talking about. I've never done it before. I might have read something about it, but I have zero skill in that space. Um, and then basically you move your way up over the course of time to an expert level, obviously, which is the highest level. And each level is kind of described, with observable behaviors to kind of help you determine where somebody probably is showing up. Observable behaviors is an important kind of approach. I mean, it's always interesting to get a self-reported, kind of determination in terms of a list of skills and how proficient somebody is in it. But it's also interesting to get the line manager or the team leader's view. If you're working away from your line manager and you're on a separate kind of development team, as an example, your Scrum Master, for instance, in an agile delivery mode, would probably have a very interesting level of observability. So might peers. And it'd be kind of important to kind of get as much 360-degree data so that you can then triangulate on something that's really quite accurate in terms of where it is you land. It's also important to be honest with yourself. You're only going to hurt yourself if you kind of are self-aggrandizing and you're telling everybody, oh, I can do all of this stuff. I'm amazing. That actually puts you in a worse position than if you actually rocked up and said, oh, there's a bunch of stuff I don't understand. Can you please help? So don't ever hesitate to say, I'm not quite there yet. Please help me, kind of like develop a development plan. Um, so that's basically, kind of what these proficiency levels are. I use tools or have used tools in the past, like Culture Amp as an example, which kind of helps you take a look at skills or competencies and then help determine the relative proficiency. The same is with Clue as well. That tool will very, very quickly and very graphically kind of like walk you through that process. And it's a heck of a lot easier than possibly I'm making it sound right now. Skills assessments are often, kind of inflated. We just talked about that, and inconsistent due to kind of self-reporting bias, right? So building sort of an evidence-based framework kind of ensures a much more accurate and accountable approach from this perspective. Um, Key evidence, again, would include things like work portfolios and code repositories if you're a developer, performance dashboards based on the sort of key performance indicators that are set for each role, if you have those. 360-degree feedback, we just talked about that. Project deliverables, what the outcome was. Was it on time? Was it on budget? Was it a great result? And certification scores. All of those things can factor into your determining what level of proficiency somebody has. And it's important, right? Because quality guardrails are really kind of critical to kind of maintain assessment integrity. You don't want to have situations where people are, for whatever reason, assessed at a much higher level of competence and capability than they're exhibiting. That would raise a lot of eyebrows, and I think you lose credibility in that regard. So having collaboration sessions, for instance, with people managers, just like you would do for performance assessment, can be a very helpful approach to kind of sorting this stuff out. And then bias, detection algorithms. If you have tools, that can help you kind of like ferret that out, that's super important. And then, again, triangulating on the evidence in essence, and getting as many different, kind of clean sources as you possibly can is super useful. Staying grounded with external data was something I mentioned earlier. I showed you what a skill profile and all of the details, that go into creating one of those things looks like. And it was daunting, right? If you had to do that across, who knows, 500, 600 skills, depending on the size and complexity of your organization, your head probably would explode. And that would be really difficult to manage. So it's important that we are super clear, super accurate in how it is we label these skills, and then really kind of understand what the makeup of these skills are. And there are a number of interesting, useful databases that have been around for quite some time. Sophia, the SFIA, I've seen used quite a bit, for instance, in the tech companies I typically look after. But there are, again, plenty of other useful kind of tools in that space. So I would encourage you to go poke around and have a look. And of course, I'm going to make this presentation available to anybody who wants to look further into it. So this notion of cleaning the skill soup, super important. I want to show you how like organizations can use AI as an example to transform what otherwise feels like a sprawling and inconsistent skill data, into clean, actionable intelligence, right? So the 4 steps typically would be to extract skills from unstructured text. AI loves doing this. AI will take a look at whatever it is you've thrown at it, and it will then try to make sense of that stuff and then come back and say, this is what I think you meant to say. And it can be very useful, especially since it's basically, at the end of the day, a probabilistic, kind of word tool that can help you kind of reorganize and make much more succinct and understandable the stuff that you're looking for. Normalize the skills synonyms. This is the whole issue of language, right? And all of the variations. As much as we want to be accepting of people's varying understandings of what a particular skill is, it's super important that everybody, whether it's a people manager, whether it's a leader, whether it's an HR person, or the employee themselves, has exactly the same language and the same understanding of what a particular skill is. Okay? Mapping the skill relationships like prerequisites and complementary capabilities and career pathways is wonderful, a wonderful challenge for AI. It loves to kind of look at those. I mean, they kind of think in vector diagrams anyway. So that's exactly how the information inside a large language model is structured. It looks for relational connections. So this is like the perfect application for AI. And that's baked into, for instance, the tool that I support, Clue, has that capacity to kind of build an ontology. And then, of course, you want to validate the outputs from AI to make sure it wasn't hallucinating, it wasn't making things up, because you've given it a goal. It wants desperately to impress you and to achieve that goal, but it might be wrong. So you got to make sure that you kind of validate that again with your subject matter experts that initially kind of set you on the right path. And the key is really to kind of combine the scale and the speed of AI, right, with the nuance and expertise of a human review. This needs to be a human delivered system, but the help of AI is super important. You then kind of want to also think about skills, because a lot of people talk about this. There's tasks, and then there's skills, and then there's competencies. I hear all these terms kind of bantied about, and oftentimes they are interchangeable in terms of people's thinking. But in truth, they're actually quite different things. Okay. A task is something that you perform, right? I am going to go wash the 50 dishes that are in that sink, and I have to get that done by a particular time frame. That's a task I have to complete. The skill is how quickly can I do this? Because I've done it before, hopefully, and I've got a pretty high level of proficiency in this space. I also know what tools to use, what soap to use, and the speed with which I can actually get this done satisfactorily. That's sort of a critical skill. And then a competency would be looking at the broader picture of everything. I'm going to not just go and wash those dishes. I'm going to make this place shine. I'm going to make it look good. And when I'm done, it'll be like I was never there. Right. And that's going to be a host of competencies. Yes, involving things like cleaning, but also my perception in terms of what it is I see, knowing what chemicals and tools to use, all these kinds of things, a combination of things. And so I think that's what, this slide is kind of getting to. Um, and that's when we start to get into things like dynamic skill profiles rather than just sort of static job descriptions, right? This is going to allow you a lot more flexibility in staffing and clearer expectations for employees as well once they actually get here. Each role in this particular case is a weighted collection of required and preferred skills, right, with defined proficiency thresholds. So now it's like quite clear of how do I kind of measure up against this particular skill and what level of proficiency do I have with it? And it creates a lot more role clarity while enabling kind of adaptability, for the business needs. Um, Dynamic job profiles will generate much more valuable outputs, I think, like smart job scorecards, right? This notion of kind of understanding how a particular job is meant to. It's kind of like a KPI sheet, if you will. It helps with career leveling frameworks in terms of what skills does this group have in this particular department versus this group in this particular department, and if we're demanding this level of skill and proficiency over here, why wouldn't we have an equal kind of connection with that? And maybe that's a point of debate as an example, but it's important to have that debate because if you get this right, if you get this organizational sorted out, there's so many different applications, beneficial applications, money saving, money making applications that you can kind of use this dynamic skill modeling process for, including things like pay and promotion and succession planning, as well as career mapping and navigating, personalized development. And then, of course, all the fascinating metadata that your leadership will get around talent inventory or skill inventory, skill density, skill liquidity, and internal marketplace opportunities, things of that nature. So you nail this and you start to accrue some serious benefits. And we're going to talk a little bit about that next. So this is going to talk a bit about, and again, you're going to get this presentation, and this kind of is more of a detailed view as to the potential benefits that can accrue, if you will, by kind of putting together and really carefully organizing your end-to-end skills taxonomies and ontologies. Um, in this particular one, I kind of outlined, what a thing was, how it works, and why it matters. So smart job scorecards, as an example, I'm not going to go through every one of these, is basically it's an objective, skills weighted scores for hiring or for internal moves, and it provides a transparent evidence-based fit score. So how often have we worked for organizations where kind of Bob got promoted ahead of you, and you've been there in the position longer. You think you have much more proficiency and skill capability than Bob did. Um, and you're like, why is it he got the chance to be promoted and I wasn't approached with regard to that? And you find out later on it's a political thing. Bob has connections to the CEO, as an example, or a board member, or whatever the case. Somebody put in a good word for Bob, possibly not for you, and it's an unfair process, and that kind of stuff happens quite a lot, which is unfortunate. Why not make this process scientific? Why not be much more specific about this is what you're meant to do and what capabilities you're meant to have? To be able to then compare and contrast people on that basis is a hell of a lot more fair, objective, and intelligent. And that's really kind of true for things like career leveling, looking at compensation anchors and comparing and contrasting internal equity. If Susan does the same job as Mark, why is Mark paid 20% more than Susan? And they've been here for the same time. They have largely the same academic background and credentials. And from a skills profile, it looks like they're pretty much on par in terms of what it is they're meant to deliver. We need to look at that. Either we need to adjust Susan upward, or we need to kind of figure out, do we have something sort of that we need to sort out for Mark? That's really important stuff, especially as legislation is now coming in requiring pay transparency. So personalized learning paths and succession planning models, all of those things come into effect, which are super, super important. Again, I'm going to probably kind of gloss over some of this because it gets into realms that I don't think we're exactly ready for in terms of, for instance, having a skills model that is directly correlated, even to the level of causation, with pay levels, as an example. I think there's a lot of cleanup we need to do in our books because people get paid for all sorts of different reasons. And some of them are unfair and some of them are not right. And frankly, oftentimes people have had their pay levels changed for various issues. Maybe they got a better offer somewhere else, but they're super skilled and capable. We can't lose that person. We have to give them a counter offer. They took the counter offer. Now they're paid 20% more than everybody else in that particular category. You do that about 50 times over, right? Over the course of a couple of years, and suddenly your pay is just completely out of whack. So again, having skills data will help you kind of do that equalization process. And it may be ugly, may be really painful to look at, but it needs looking into, right? Your legal team has to look at it. Your finance team has to look at it. Eventually, your CEO is going to have to take a look at it. You got to get this stuff right. And it's really down to HR, I think, to ensure that we are thinking through those elements intelligently with evidence. Precision learning, super important. We spend a lot of time, effort, and money, if you're lucky, on learning and development in the workplace. You got to make those pounds and dollars and euros count. How do you do that? Well, you do that by being extraordinarily targeted in terms of what skills a particular training capability would provide. Also, to increase the levels of engagement and learning adoption, it's super important not to be sending people to generic training courses. You always ever have your compliance, your health and safety stuff, those types of issues for sure. What you don't want to do, though, is just keep sending people to the leadership class, the management class, the class on being more empathic and a better listener. Sending people to stuff like that is a bit soul destroying, and they know the game. They just have to get through the training so they can click the box to say that they've done it, and then they never have to think about it again. Why not create instances that are much more tailored to the individual, their needs, their challenges, their skills gaps, where they're hanging on every word and watching very carefully the material and they're being quizzed on it. And they know that this is their bridge to, competency so that they can kind of move on to whatever goal they've chosen for themselves. That's basically what we need to do is kind of marry up this process of what are your goals, business and personal and developmental? How is it you're being assessed in terms of those things on a 360-degree basis? How are you identifying the skills gaps? And then what remedy can you then, based on these skills gaps, apply to an individual, right, that ultimately is going to get them over the hump and to kind of cover off those skills gaps? And is this a continuous process? And is the line manager supporting and coaching and nurturing this individual through that process? Great organizations do this well, and they're not perfect. I get that. It's naive to think that that is the case. But organizations that thrive as learning environments with a strong culture on continuous improvement in all aspects are the ones that basically win. So, the talent marketplace thing, really interesting concept, and that was sort of one of the titles of this session. If you get to the point where you have mapped out indeed all of the skills and the proficiency levels and so forth, and everybody is kind of understanding how it was they were assessed against those things. You also have mapped that out to each and every role in the organization. The next step would be to consider what are we doing internally to make sure that our top, especially our top performers, but I mean our good performers, everybody in that category is offered an opportunity to do something different, to expand their horizons, to grow, to develop, to think differently, to stay fresh, in an organizational environment. People often leave organizations, typically a couple of reasons, three reasons. One is my manager, frankly, and I just don't get along, or we have a horrible relationship, or I just don't feel nurtured and looked after. Nobody seems to care, right? That's my one human interface that should be the most powerful, and it's not. The other one is I'm not getting paid enough money, or I'm watching how other people are treated. And I'm not particularly happy about that. That could be a thing. And then the other one is, and powerfully, I'm not growing. I'm not developing. I don't feel like there's any forward progress in my life, and it's soul destroying. Been doing the same job for 2.5 years. I keep getting promised the next thing, and it just never comes, right? So we have to make sure that we create a culture that says, as a manager, as a leader, it's your job to champion great performance, right? And to look after those people very carefully. They are gems. We want to make sure that they are paid right. We want to make sure that they are treated right, that they are availed to the right educational opportunities. We want to make sure that people are always ever of a mindset that says, I want to continue to grow. I want your help and nurturing basically to kind of move on to the next step. And it's hard because most organizations have been hardwired into when you find a bunch of superstars who are working for you and making you look good, never let them go, right? But then you look at people like Jack Welch and love him or hate him. He was the famous former CEO of GE. He spun out something like 8 or 9 CEOs of major Fortune 100 companies, which is quite shocking. But that was his ethos. His ethos was, if you don't quit this job within 2 years, in terms of being a direct report to me, I've done something wrong. I've not trained you. I've not coached you. I've not pushed you. I have not developed you into somebody who, could work on par with me. And he was really serious about that. And frankly, if you didn't make that move, he typically would kind of push you out. That was a lot of controversy around his. So that was a real issue for him. So anyway, this is something to kind of think about. If you have the skills taxonomy and ontology baked in, everybody is very clear on what it is they're meant to know and for what reason. Then creating an internal marketplace can be super powerful and give people options constantly of different things that potentially can do. Right. So we're not going to spend loads of time on this because this is basically kind of a demo scenario. This is to kind of like outline for you like how you might approach doing something like this. And what I did not do is deliberately not include Clue as an example or some of the other tools that are out there um, to kind of inject in this because I wanted you to kind of understand the kind of the kind of critical elements associated with it. Um, so the idea here is to kind of show how sort of an AI talent matching process might help you solve like real staffing challenges, right? While you're trying to develop it. And the sort of key points to kind of emphasize here are around sort of very tight timelines and a scale of rollout. So 15 team members across 200 locations in 90 days, as an example. The specific skills required, including, say, retail operations or change management and technical integration, how an AI system analyzes requirements and kind of identifies candidates and then suggests an optimal team composition. This part to me is so critically important. And then sort of the positive business outcomes achieved, right, by getting, including sort of getting faster team assembly, better project results, high participant satisfaction. It's really this notion of kind of knowing what people need to be in what roles for what projects in what fashion is the magic of driving great organizations. It's all well and good to stretch people. It's all well and good to kind of put somebody who's inexperienced into a new project if in fact they have some level of supervision and they're not being set up for failure. But it's brilliant if you know at a sort of a behavioral molecular skill level what somebody is capable of, what they've done in the past, to say, wow, this person would be perfect for leading this team. And what we need to do is scan the entire environment to find out what team support members would also be perfect to kind of go to launch, say, a new product, as an example. That is a huge and very powerful use case for consideration with skills-based organizations. We're getting close, people, I promise. Skills data is sort of like a strategic asset then, right? Because it requires sort of like dedicated governance and management to kind of make sure that it's still got a good, strong quality and it's got strong adoption. Really critical to have clear roles and responsibilities, and critical to kind of prevent skills initiatives from becoming orphaned, right, or failing to scale. That's really important as well. The product owner in this particular case is responsible for the overall strategy, the roadmap, the stakeholder alignment, for the skills data platform. So it's always important, and this is, trust me when I tell you, it's a kick-ass, very cool job to kind of be the master of skills validation and skills model alignment, and then skills model application in an organization. This is the kind of stuff HR should be focused on because it is the science of people. So important too to have like data stewards, right? To make sure that the quality of the data that's in your systems is there, number one. Number two is accurate, super important, and that you're validating it, right? And that you're maintaining it, making sure you're on top of it. You also want to make sure too that the rest of the organization is involved. This is not HR in isolation. You want to have sort of a subject matter expert, I don't know, counsel, I guess, if you will, that kind of provides, critical expertise as to what these roles are, why they are what they are. It's important the organization think about that stuff. And so that's critical. Also, you want to get your rewards partner, oftentimes who is sat maybe in the finance function, as an example, or in larger organizations, maybe sat in HR. Rewards should go along with, the quality and depth and proficiency in skills. People should be rewarded for that stuff, right? And it's going to be down then to you all to get together to say, how is it we're going to represent people expanding their skills capabilities and then exhibiting that in real life? That stuff should be gold dust and should be looked after. Obviously, things like version control and system processes, super important. And obviously, regular algorithmic audits to make sure that there's no bias in the system, that males are being chosen over females from a skills perspective and things of that nature. So again, that's all super important. Again, lessons learned. I kind of covered a lot of this stuff off, but this issue of, boiling the ocean, having too many kind of versions of the same word or same skill, synonym soup is a problem. Having opinion-based ratings, not on. You need to kind of go with as much objectivity as you possibly can. Um, Setting up an internal marketplace and then realizing that nobody is either putting jobs there because, frankly, they want to go hire somebody fresh, new with new skills, and they don't trust the internal population, or that people, frankly, are nervous about letting go their great people. So they're not going to kind of allow folks access to that sort of thing. And then, of course, this issue of vendor lock-in, right? Having getting wedded, if you will, to skills taxonomies, in terms of the way the vendor looks at it versus the way you potentially could look at it. It's important that you have that flexibility, and you can kind of take it on, and challenge it. So again, I've kind of outlined, and I want to make sure we have time for questions. I've kind of outlined what sort of a 60 to 90-day roadmap might look like if you were going to kind of undertake this process. It's just hypothetical, of course, and it's really interesting. If you did this on your own, it could take that 90-day period. If you use tools, for instance, like Clue, you can actually get there much more quickly, depending on the size of your organization and complexity, of course. But I kind of divided this into 4 key phases, right? Each one of them is kind of building momentum and delivering measurable business value, right? In the first 2 weeks, you lay the foundations for selecting the job family. Pick one that you can really kind of laser focus on. Assemble a core team, your subject matter experts, and establish sort of a governance process around how it is you're going to kind of take a look at this stuff, and then define what the success metrics ought to look like. It's always good to do that with every project you do, of course. Then in weeks 3 to 6, you build the framework, right? And you include the taxonomy, the skill taxonomy, determine the skills, period, and then the taxonomy around that. Then you determine the proficiency levels of each of those. And then you go through an assessment process, with the individuals who are assigned to the roles that you basically fleshed out with skills. And then you determine what the quality standards need to look like. What does good look like in essence? Then weeks 7 to 10, you focus on the technology platform, right? Configuring, integrating data, training the algorithms, and conducting user testing. Super important. Again, there are different tools out there depending on the size and complexity of your organization. What I love about Clue and the group I work with is it kind of it can cover off enterprise, and we've been working with some rather large institutions, as of late, but we're taking them one chunk at a time. Again, we're not boiling the ocean with this stuff. We're learning along the way as well, learning about personalities, we're learning about their particular challenges, how they view and kind of understand the skills, so on and so forth. But I love the fact that it's kind of really perfect for sort of that mid-market realm as well. And then the final 2 weeks are really your launch phase, right? Where you kind of deploy the pilot marketplace and onboard users and seed opportunities, do lots of communication, measure everything early and often, and make sure that you're staying on track. And then your key deliverables basically will be your skill taxonomy, your proficiency framework, your assessment process, your governance structure, the operational talent platform, other pilot opportunities, and then your baseline metrics. So that's basically what that process broadly would look like, again, hypothetically. I've included here an interesting excuse me, case study where Walmart, who deals with hundreds of thousands of employees on an annual basis and has multiple different types of roles across the organization, moved to a skills first initiative. Again, they were looking at 100,000 in-demand jobs for skills development, and they were trying to kind of make sense of this whole process. I'm not going to go into great detail about this, but this is to give you a sense for Even the largest, most complex organizations are trying to make sense of this stuff because if they don't, then they're possibly wasting money, right? And they're possibly doing harm, if you will, to their good performers. And we don't want to do that. We want to make sure also that we're making intelligent pay decisions, training decisions, growth and assessment, promotions, all those kinds of things with data. And that's basically how we're going to go do that. Just conscious of time, and I know that I probably have too many slides. Setting up benchmarks for success is super important. And I've offered here like four different broad categories. Um, Canonical skills, basically, that's a term I've never heard of before, but basically those are sort of like the core skills that you basically have washed and made sure everybody is clear relative to the semantic meaning of these things and so forth. Those are sort of like the core critical skills. Again, they're clearly thinking about massive enterprises here, and they're looking at 1,000, normalized skills. That's a hell of a lot of skills, to be honest with you. It's a crazy amount. You don't have to do near as many as that. Profile completion. Again, achieving at least 80% after you're all said and done would just be an amazing thing, to be honest with you. Um, Assessment reliability, 70% would be, again, amazing. So don't you don't think you have to like hit 100% in every instance. If you're always ever focused on continuously improving it and you're identifying where things are broken or not working, that's good enough. And then starting off, getting something like 15%, even down the road, of gig participation, of internal marketplace movement is amazing, right? That's 15% that you don't have to go to the external market to recruit. And that's 15% of the people who are like being availed to interesting opportunities internally and are therefore not leaving your company. And they're bringing and carrying with them all the institutional knowledge that, frankly, wouldn't otherwise be available to them. I talked here about driving adoption, right? Um, this is going to have to start at the top. The leadership has to be behind this 110% and has to be behind the ROI of it, yes, in terms of the financials, but importantly, behind the fact that you want to be driving a culture that says, if you're here, if you're willing to work and you want to learn and you want to continuously improve, we will always ever have an opportunity for you. Okay. So that's kind of the messaging. And then it has to be lived day in and day out and observed, importantly, by employees. So it's also an amazing employee value proposition. So when you're recruiting people and saying, well, why should I come to you guys? I have a perfectly good job and I'm quite settled. You hit them with stuff like this. I'm like, well, actually, I haven't been promoted in 5 years. So wow, that's a huge, huge uplift. Um, Making sure that, yes, you're kind of carrying out a very scientific kind of process here and a data-driven process, but also doing things like driving the emotions behind this, right? And you're taking from people their lived experience behind this and getting people to kind of like provide testimonials around it, celebrate visible success stories, super important. And always ever provide, the contact to people who can kind of, help people understand how this works, deal with concerns, issues, challenges. Super, super important. So we're almost done. Last two slides, you'd be happy to know. Um, your next move, right? First thing is to pick a job family with clear skill requirements, right? And subject matter experts available to speak to it that has high impact and has leadership support, right? So look at things like engineering or sales or marketing. They're oftentimes like pretty good starting points because they have a lot of visibility. Partner with 3 to 5 experts and define the 15 to 25 core skills with observable, kind of proficiency indicators. In other words, build that framework out so you're quite clear as to what, say, the 4 to 6 levels of proficiency look like, and then figure out how it is you're going to determine if that exists. Seed your marketplace with diverse opportunities that showcase the skills. So in other words, kind of be good about stretch assignments. Try to get people out of their comfort zone so they can kind of learn new skills. And sometimes that's hard, and sometimes they feel like they're failing. But just look after them, mentor them, coach them, make sure that they don't feel like they've been thrown to the wolves, but in fact, they've been given an opportunity to expand. Super important. and then track metrics, like time to staff projects, internal fill rates, employee satisfaction, skill development velocity, super important, right? And prepare a return on investment story for stakeholders, because they always ever love to hear that you're doing super clever things and that those things are going to accrue amazing benefits, not just nice to haves, not just feel goods, but yeah, this is reducing our attrition by 15%. This is increasing our time to fill rate from a recruitment perspective down to 30 days when it used to be 60 or 90. This is, all these different things, super, super important to make sure you look at them all. And that's largely it, folks. I think we kind of we talked all this whole issue about factors like business impact and skill clarity, subject matter expert availability, and things of that nature. You can start with the technical roles too, because they often have very clear skill definitions, while customer-facing roles, can obviously demonstrate immediate, kind of business value, especially if you actually measure whether or not a customer who is otherwise looking to leave the organization got turned around, as an example. So that those folks are important to look at. Second point is about the evidence that already exists in your organization, right? Look at the performance reviews, look at project deliverables, look at, kind of LMS completion data, look at certification records, whatever it is you can find that kind of indicates a level of performance, proficiency, or evidence that somebody's achieved a certain, capability, is super, super useful. AI is brilliant at helping with that process as well, right? The third point is about kind of potential governance bottlenecks, right? Such as skill definition approval, right? Proficiency calibrations, managers training, the integration with compensation systems, right? Plan ahead and start to build a coalition of support around this and engage, again, with whatever vendor you ultimately end up using, because oftentimes they can solve a number of these things or help solve these things for you. I know at Clue, Clue Labs, as I'm sort of the principal of that, we offer, sort of continuing professional services support that go above and beyond the actual use of the tool. That often is very illuminating, for organizations to really kind of understand how is it we're structured, what do we need to worry about, how do we need to think of this through, and how do we scale this process? Super useful. And then finally, this continuing conversation in terms of discussing your own kind of specific implementation strategy, timeline, success metrics, as your unique organizational context will kind of shape the optimal approach. So it's really important, obviously, that you can talk to somebody about this, to work this stuff through. You can